Our next session has a very distinguished panel, the science in literature and the literature in science writing. We have with us Angela Saini, who is, of course, a science journalist. We have novelist Ruchir Joshi. We have the poet and songwriter Srijato. And of course, we have Sir Venki Ramakrishnan, who needs no introduction. And they will all be in conversation with Malavika Banerjee, bringing in different perspectives of both the sciences and the arts. I would like to invite onto stage all the panelists and hand over to Malavika.
So good evening, friends, and I'm feeling like an umpire because I'm sitting between science and literature in a way, but what we're trying to establish is that there are no silos of this nature, so perhaps it's all right that you're sitting like this. So welcome to this session, which has many reasons why it kind of hit me in while I was programming. One was when Venki was here last, I rather childishly introduced him as someone who knows the flowers by their names while we just enjoy the colors of the flowers. And this was at Victoria Memorial, which was in full bloom at that time. And then as soon as we got off the stage, he said, but I enjoy the colors as well. So that's when I realized we in our heads, have these images and these stereotypes about how scientists only think about things in their molecular and chemical way, their identities as biological and chemical beings, and that this side of the argument doesn't have an ounce of scientific knowledge in their heads. They're very ready to admit to that, this side. So I'll start with you, Venki, because you've come here with 2 books to a literature festival, and typically, even about 15 years ago, when one started seeing these festivals, it was very rare to see a scientist coming with a book that was meant to be read by a more general audience than an academic, demography. So when did you start making that transition for writing to, let's say, the muggles?
I think my motivations were somewhat complex, and in each case, I was annoyed about something and felt that I had to write and set the record straight from my point of view, anyway. In the case of the first book, Gene Machine, it was a memoir about the race for the structure of the ribosome, and while that race was happening, I realized it had a lot of parallels.
Can you just raise the mic volume, please?
It had a lot of parallels with other races, including the double helix, the structure of DNA. And I felt that it illustrated how scientists behave when when they know they're going after something important, and there's potential fame and glory if it all works out. And apart from the fame and glory, they want to be the person known for having made that breakthrough. There's that sort of element of ego, and at the same time, scientists also help each other in amazing ways. So all through that work, I received help from all sorts of people who never wanted any credit or acknowledgement. So it showed the full spectrum of human behavior, from ambition and ego, jealousy, all the way to altruism and really, benevolence. So that was the motivation there. The second book is about an area that has become extremely hot, which is the science of longevity. And there are lots of legitimate reasons for studying longevity and doing something about health and old age, because societies are aging and so on. But it's also attracted both outright charlatans, but also scientists who have somehow hyped things. They've got companies, they're selling supplements or products, they're often selling advice. And so it's bringing out, again, various elements And I thought that as someone with no particular, at least no financial skin in the game, except I'd like my book to do well. But other than that, but someone who was close enough to the field to be able to read the primary literature, I thought I could take a hard look at where we are in the longevity field. So they were motivated by somewhat personal reasons, but that doesn't mean that's all there was. There's also the desire to communicate to a broad audience. And you said that there are no silos, but actually there are. And the silos were pointed out by C.P. Snow in his famous essay, I think, The Two Cultures, about how, and he was really on the side of scientists. He said if a scientist didn't know about Shakespeare or Beethoven, he would be considered uncultured and illiterate. But if a humanities person didn't know about relativity or quantum mechanics or the genetic code, that would be okay. That's fine. So there was this asymmetry in understanding. Anyway, I've gone on too long.
No, I'm smiling at them because they did kind of say they didn't know much about science. So I'll start again from that corner. And Ruchir, what truly alarmed you when I called you onto this panel?
For those of us who are Indians and Calcuttans, I have been called an arts case all my life, right? An arts case means someone who's not very bright and therefore has to graduate through doing all the soft things like, the arts and humanities, because I'm not smart enough to be a scientist, really, or win a Nobel Prize, or actually find out something real that's new. No, I grew up first in Calcutta and then I went to a boarding school in Rajasthan. Both places, I now realize that I was mostly not well served by my teachers. I was a bit of a maverick. I was interested in painting and drawing and reading books and stuff, but I found science and mathematics especially very hard. But there was a terror in my mind every time I went to school for two kinds of teachers, the Hindi teacher and the maths teacher. And this started when I was 4 or 5, and this terror stayed in my mind till I graduated from school at the age of 17. Now, when I start thinking, why both? Why Hindi and maths? They're not related. But the reason for that was my comfort zone very quickly became English. It very quickly became the area of poetry, history, some geography, but more sociology and photography, filmmaking, all that stuff, in which Hindi wasn't a big part. I mean, English was fine, and then at home there was Gujarati and Bangla in the streets, but Hindi was an alien language for a long time. It was a no-go zone, and so was chemistry and biology. So these things twinned, and also the teachers who taught those subjects to you knew that you hated him, and they treated you badly, and they treated those students who really loved the subject automatically, already came ready-made, they treated them much better, because that was easier to work with those students. And I now realize that had I met a good maths teacher or a good biology teacher, maybe, I don't know, I might not have been a scientist, but at least I wouldn't have been so ignorant or diffident about science, And now all the more, as an artist, you cannot afford to ignore what's happening in technology and in science and in all your politics, all your social movements. Everything is imbued in, completely. You cannot be an idiot about science anymore. So I'm very interested in scientific books and things that I can understand in articles and stuff. But it's a very recent phenomenon. So
it's a recent phenomenon also because people like Angela and Venki are
exactly.
writing with your
Absolutely.
interest in mind and
also
wanting
making
to
science, as Einstein said, if you
inclusive.
understand something, if you can't explain something simply enough, you don't understand it well enough. I mean, I kind of hold by that. You may not be able to explain every nuance and every complexity, but what is the general idea? You can kind of, and it requires a certain kind of distilled poetry for you to do it. But I've had scientists explain stuff to me, and then I say, okay, and then the light goes on.
Yes, and the light has gone on a lot for Angela, because I've been following her books as well for very long and been wanting to invite her. So you write you're a journalist, so you by definition have to write with a less informed academic audience in mind, or do you do both? Do you segue between writing for the community and writing for, larger publication across, different countries like your inferior, superior, and patriarch?
Well, there are lots of different kinds of science writing. There is that kind that is there to inspire and explain and show the beauty of science. The kind of science writing I do, I think, is perhaps a bit closer to Venki's in that I'm looking at the personalities and the people. I mean, if you think about it, in the history of science writing, perhaps the most beautiful and one of the most popular pieces of writing is The Periodic Table by Primo Levi. And it's hardly science writing at all. It's really a memoir. But there is science in there. But that is what science is. It's real people trying to discover things, living their life at the same time as they're trying to discover things, and having these pushes and pulls of funding and ego and family life and all these other pressures that they're under. And for me as a journalist, at least, I mean, I started off writing very technical things. I used to write for journals, engineering journals, technical journals on very arcane topics for an academic audience. These days I write for everyday people. But the principles are the same because, frankly, when you're within one discipline, other disciplines can almost be a mystery to you, especially if they're further away. So you have to try to be accessible anyway. These days, scientists, as Venki was saying, there are silos that operate within the sciences, and you're expected to be much more specialist than ever. And so I often find that I meet academics who know a huge amount about their own subject and know practically nothing about an adjacent subject. And I think that's where writers like myself come in. We have to be generalists. We don't know a huge amount about any one thing, but the trick is trying to amass enough knowledge about it and also expose what goes underneath. For me, science journalism is like political journalism or business journalism in that I'm investigating and interrogating a system that has huge power over how we understand ourselves and how we live. And now more so than ever, you only have to look at Trump's inauguration this week. The front row is all these tech Silicon Valley guys. And so these tech titans, these scientists, engineers, are more powerful than they've ever been. And I think the pressure on science writers is to understand that and to demystify some of the myths sometimes that they try to sell us.
Okay, so so your whole DNA, if I may say so, is to demystify when you're writing for a more general public.
Well, I think there are a lot of people out there with vested interests who will try to blind you with science in the hope that you will not understand what they're really trying to do. And so I think my job as a journalist is to make sure that people understand what it is really that they're trying to do, what their ulterior motive is there. Because as Ruchir was saying, you can, if you grow up having taken that humanities path, which many people do, or not having gone very far down that science path, then it's very easy to get blinded by these things and think, wow, that's incredible. It must be like with artificial intelligence. The hype just gets you, and there are a lot of very wealthy, powerful people who try to convince you that this thing is something really that it's not. And, we have to work very hard to make sure that people understand what it really is. Yeah.
Wonderful. And now the poet. So is there any, we use terms like rhythm, meter, the weightage of some words, how there's a cadence to the whole poem. So what is the science you would put into it? And you also said you tell me a story, so this is a good time to do that.
Yeah, I'll come to the story later, rather, if we have ample time. First, let me thank KLM and Mala for having me on this great and nightmarish session that kept me, going, thinking that what would I say when I would sit with these brilliant people around me. And as you know, every table has an odd card that ruins your hand. So I'm playing that card, so please pardon me. But coming to meter, which is very important when you come to Bengali poetry, because most of the Bengali poetry you find straight from Vidyapati to us, if we keep us in the same bracket, it's metered, it's rhymed. So in my case, it's very interesting that I grew up in a family of Hindustani classical music. So I took up the technique or science of putting meter in poetry from various tals. You know, when I was very young, we have been given talim in Hindustani Shastriya Sangeet, and bandishes were being taught. So we came to know if there's 16 beats, it's called teen tal. If there's 10 beats, it's called jhap tal. So there are bandishes in tals. And later on, when I really tried writing poems and fixing my meters, and reading poems too, when I came across Shankho Ghosh or Alok Ranjan or Sunil Gangopadhyay or Shakti Chattopadhyay, I found, oh, this is a poem that is basically written on teen tal, which is 16 beats. Or this is a poem that is basically written on jhap tal, which is 10 beats. So in my case particularly, Indian classical music and the tala, they have served me a lot to understand the rhythm and meters in poems. So still, when I write a poem and a certain meter is in on mind, I think of a bandish. A bandish in Jinjoti or Sham Kalyan would help me to understand that meter or rhyme, not any poetry. So I kind of took the science or technique of writing in meters or rhyming is from music, not from poetry, not from literature.
And you also have another life as a fiction writer. So, and apparently you're now venturing into science fiction. So, how difficult was that?
It was really very difficult, but
Tell us about your book, the name.
Oh, the name, it's so coincidental that it came out from the press just today morning. It's called 4043, and it was written in 2006. Trying to depict that what would happen on this earth when 4043 comes as a year. So I didn't try to predict something, I tried to imagine something. I think you need more of imagination than of scientific knowledge to write a science fiction. I should not be telling this sitting in front of you, but I think imagination plays a huge part, and I tried to imagine that what can happen on this earth. And definitely I used an alien force as a catalyst, like they all do. And they come to the planet Earth, and they take all the powers from the politicians, which I have always dreamed, that politicians would never have power, never have. So they take all the powers from the politicians, from the bureaucrats, and the passports are all, nullified. Yeah, and the earth is one single nation without any war, without any election, without any cabinets. And that was a dream that I cherished, and I wrote it like a science fiction. That is called 4043. But some of those things, remote calling or seeing someone whom you are calling, has already happened. So we didn't have to wait till 4043 to Zoom call someone or video call someone. I also wrote that it somehow didn't take much time to happen. This is a book more about my dream about a nationless world, a politics-less, a less world. And I don't think that will ever happen. So this book will remain evergreen because it won't happen ever.
Lovely. So he spoke about imagination, but that is also the domain of science, because you're imagining what can be and why what is the way it is. So you were talking about that famous quote about two silos and how he says that he felt less than intelligent because his math teacher kind of put him off science. And here you are saying that it is okay for him to say, I don't understand science, but a scientist is considered pompous, or he can't possible, uncultured, yes, if he says that he doesn't understand, the arts. So what is the domain of imagination in science?
I think, I don't know if Angela will agree, but I think it has a different quality from imagination in, say, arts or in the fine arts or literature. And the point is that if a scientist makes a discovery, to some extent you're unveiling what's already there. And even if you are very clever and imaginative in your use of methods and how you arrive at the discovery, and also sometimes you just stumble upon it, so there's no really luck involved. Whereas with somebody who's creating a work of art, and just to backtrack, if two or more scientists make the same discovery, they usually arrive at the same answer, or a very similar answer. But if you take works of art or literature, it's different. I think, Beethoven's String Quartet is unique to Beethoven, or some play by Shakespeare, or something like that is unique because they're creating it rather than discovering it. And so there's a different quality of imagination.
Okay. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, who am I to disagree with Venki? Yeah, of course. I think that's very much true, and that that's a beautiful race that is involved in scientific discovery, that you want to be the first one to get there. Although I do think that there are certain areas of science in which the way that things are discovered or the way that they're interpreted can shape how the public then imagines them. So, for example, with the discovery of evolution, one of the key figures in the development of the theory of evolution was Gregor Mendel, who was an abbot. He was a man of God. He was growing in order to prove heredity, how heredity works. He was growing peas in his garden, but he very selectively chose certain peas that he knew would produce a certain result, a nice clean result, instead of a messy result. And because he left out that messiness, we now have in our imaginations this idea that heredity works in a very one-to-one way, that you get this input, you put in this input and you get this output. And as biologists and evolutionary scientists know, it's sometimes much messier than that, that you can, there are random things that can happen in evolutionary development and in biological development within our own bodies and within every organism that can produce unexpected results and produces things that are a bit more messy. But of course, in order to prove that scientific principle, he needed things to be clean. So, how we think about evolution now and how we think about heredity is in that very clean way, because that was how the discovery was made. If it had been couched slightly differently, if it had been presented slightly differently, maybe we would think about heredity in a slightly more messy way. So it really depends on the person. I think the person can really shape, that scientist, that discoverer, can really shape then how the rest of us think about it. And that's the grey area I love to explore as a writer, is that how in history do certain quirks of personality or the way in which scientific research is done at that particular time and place then lead to the findings that you have later or the ideas that we have later. And that's one of the things I love about Indian science. The first book I ever wrote was on Indian science. I traveled the country to understand what Nehru termed the scientific temper. This kind of cultural idea that Indians love science and technology and maths, which I think is very much true. And, that's why there's so many brilliant Indian scientists and engineers working all over the world. But there is also a metaphysical quality to it. There is a, slight willingness to think out, far outside the box, to bring in certain elements of spirituality sometimes and religion, sometimes in ways that feel completely inappropriate to scientists in the West, but are tolerated within India and in fact sometimes even encouraged, which may not feel like modern Western science, or how modern science should be done, but I think it's beautiful in its own way because perhaps it could give you something, a different kind of perspective on the world, a different idea that somebody else might not have.
Okay. So she spoke about religion and science. Now, our epics are great works of imagination. And, you have these flying chariots and these gods who have heads replaced and stuff. So sometimes, in our enthusiasm to show this scientific temper, especially recently, we kind of take the world of literature and sap all the imagination and try to put it as science. And I don't want this question to go into the dangerous zones it could go to, but very often, do you think that in epics across the world, what is a leap of fabulous imagination is somehow attributed to science? And I want to know how each of you feels about that. It's there even in Greek mythology. So, yes, what do you think about when that literary leap is somehow given a scientific twist?
I'm going to take it from a different angle, perhaps, which is that I've been spending a lot of time in South India, and if you spend time there, no offense, Venki, but I mean, you hang out with, what we call madrasis here, and
There are two madrasis on this.
I know, but this is the thing, is that undifferentiated, Malayalis, Tamil people, and I teach these young kids in this college, Kriya University, and these kids are attending my class, which is about the screenplay for The Godfather, or looking at John Berger's theories about looking at pictures and images and words. And at the same time, she's saying, Prof, I've got to do my thing in chemistry, so that's my capstone project, so I can't really take on this course properly. Sorry, I'm leaving. And then you see the same girl at a concert singing Carnatic at a high level of singing. And this is what continues to fascinate me, that especially in South India, more than I think in the North, that, a certain kind of quiet religiosity, a certain kind of very deep belief, maybe it's casteist, maybe it's Brahmanical, I don't know, not always, but goes hand in hand with the highest levels of maths and chemistry or whatever scientific inquiry you're doing. There's no contradiction in that brain that's doing that, even when you read about someone like Ramanujan or whatever. And I keep thinking, how does this work? And in contrast to the northern parts of our country and other parts of the country where if we go into a dangerous area, you find people doing the opposite, that they're taking both religion and science and dirtying and messing them both up out of complete ignorance and not understanding. So this contradiction has been playing in my head for some time, and then I start finding myself having arguments with people who believe certain things and don't believe, and then say, what about this? Why is this in our Puranas? Why is this in the Ramayana? And I keep trying to figure out that I find myself reaching for explanations in my own head, using the simplest Hindi, if you like, or Gujarati, or Bangla, not English, and trying to explain that these are metaphors, these are symbols, these are deep imageries about something that have traveled down the centuries and have become more and more coarse and perhaps more and more sort of limited as we've come to get them, but you have to look at them in a much more nuanced and in a way as a series of signs, and you cannot take it literally, whatever is written there. And if you want to take it literally, you cannot take it in a way that harms the person sitting next to you or across the road. This whole debate's been going on, and it's getting pushed to the edge. Sooner or later, we're going to have to turn around and look at something like America, where, let's talk about other countries, the most advanced country in the world at one level is taking away the most basic right from half its citizens to choose what to do with their bodies. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And I went to America first in 1979, 1980, and this was the case in certain pockets then, and I thought, okay, feminism is here and this is going to get better, and this is one thing, whether you're Republican or whether you're Democrat or whether you're communist or socialist or whatever, Americans like their sex and they will want to protect the women's rights just because of this thing. Wrong. So, I mean, yes, I mean, how the Bible refracts, how the Quran refracts, how the Hindu text refracts, how the Buddhist text refract nowadays. I mean, again, there will be no doubt some kind of a scientific historic come, I guess, in a very imaginative looking at this time where people will figure out that why did these short circuits and these implosions start to happen in our time. But right now, that's what I'm struggling with. So in that sense, yeah, it's a very live question. I have no answers.
So what do you think about this the short circuit, as he says, about how some great imaginations of past literary texts is now being shown as science?
Very interesting question, but I don't think I have a complete answer. But I would like to emphasize on imagination again, because if we go through the epics, be it the Ramayana, be it the Mahabharata, or epics from another part of the world, so they tell some stories that weren't possible at that time, but we are seeing that happening in our lifetime, and they wrote it thousands of years back. So I can only explain this with a very imaginative minds working on the literature at that time. Very imaginative, very philosophical, very scientific minds at the same time working on writing epics and predicting, or I would rather like to say imagining things that would come alive in distant future, say 4,000 years, after 4,000 years. So whatever we are seeing now, aeroplanes or cars or engines or whatever you take, you have a connection with one of the epics that you have read. So this is kind of unexplainable if you do not put imagination on the steering. Because with science or with literature or with philosophy alone, you cannot explain this. I would rather like to emphasize that there were real imaginative people working on writing, working on literature, who put things that yeah, fantastic, and they didn't, experience in their lifetime, but they were sure that this will happen once.
Yeah. So what do you have to say about the flying saucers?
I'm sorry, I have to take a slightly contrarian view. It turns out that literature is full of predictions, and we have a highly selective confirmation bias. So if they predict a flying vehicle, which frankly, you look at birds and you wish you could fly, so it's not such a profound thing to want to have a vehicle that can fly. Then we say, and then 2,000 years or 3,000 years later, an airplane is invented in Ohio, then, people say, oh, well, these guys predicted it. Well, no, they didn't predict it. They simply like the idea of flying. And so I wouldn't call them particularly scientific. And I would say many of their predictions have no basis in fact and may never
But
come
isn't
true.
that beautiful in its own way, that it doesn't have a basis in fact, but they thought about something of that nature? Where would
Sure.
you think the danger is in thinking that actually there existed a flying machine then?
Right. So first of all, as I say, imagining flight is not profound. Actually being able to fly with a heavier than air machine, that is a remarkable achievement. But just imagining that, oh, I'd like to fly, that's not particularly profound. Or wanting to live for hundreds of years, not particularly profound. We all sort of fear death. So I'm not sure that's
really a big stroke.
But, okay, let me just to get into the argument here, Venki. What about something like the Brahmastra, which is a weapon which destroys everything? Now, what is their imagination of that weapon? There are no explosives there in those days, so it can't be a big bomb-like thing. That only happens in the last, I guess, 400 years. Or well, missiles, arrows. You had arrows, so you could imagine really powerful arrows. That's fine. But the whole idea of a weapon or some kind of a power that destroys everything around it, that there are corners where in the midst stuff happens which is not quite that predictable and not quite that unsurprising. But I think that's fluke. I don't think they were scientific people. I think it's just...
No, and it's not science.
It's not science. It's just,
it's
it's magical realism, magical unrealism, actually, which we now find interesting as artifacts, because this is actually, remember, it's not just one person's imagination, it's imagination layered on imagination. It's a whole palimpsest of imaginations built on, through generations, on what a Garuda might be, or what again, Pushpak Viman might be, what a Sudarshan Chakra might be, you know. I mean, it's, we are looking at the dreams and fears of hundreds of our ancestors. So, yeah.
Yeah, so there's that. But isn't science writing also palimpsest in a way, where one generation works on another generation, works on another generation? I think everyone can agree that, I'm now trying to get into some convergence mode here, that it is imagination. Whether it can be, it's highly creditable or not creditable is the nuance, but it didn't exist. So that is the unscientific part. When someone says, actually there existed a flying a Brahmastra. So that's where I think the danger would be. So
or plastic surgery, you know.
Or plastic surgery. So I think the danger is when, I think that's your concern as well, where it's not imagination. I mean, it's okay to imagine that, but when it's being bandied about as actual science, that's the danger. So yes, coming to the palimpsest, so how does writing, you know, the whole process happen when you're going from Darwin onwards and right up to Siddharth Mukherjee?
I know that you're trying to get away from this topic, but I'll very quick just come back to it very fast, because it's interesting that we landed on this idea of flying machines in ancient texts, because when I was researching that first book, Geek Nation, I went to Melkort. I met these religious scholars who literally do believe these flying machines existed. In fact, they had pictures on the wall of what they looked like. I took photos of them. And so they believed very literally that this was real, that there was this scientific engineering knowledge that existed thousands of years ago and had only recently been rediscovered. And you were right. I mean, that's where we have to kind of wonder what's going on. That's, you know, what.
Sorry,
what is
where did you go
to
see this?
This is in Melkort. There is an entire chapter. I'm sorry, I wrote this 15 years ago, so I'm trying to reach into my imagination to try and remember when, you know, all the little details. But I can give you those later. But it's essentially next to a library. There's a very old ancient library there, and next to that they have these religious scholars who are working on these texts, trying to decipher them, understand them, and they believe these things very literally. And of course, since then, things have taken an even more interesting turn politically when it comes to these questions. But just coming back to this imagination question, scientists themselves, and I think this is where the arts and literature and science fiction plays such an important role, is that scientists themselves can be bound by what they believe to be possible based on the world around them and what other people are able to imagine. And this comes up repeatedly when you look at the science of gender, for instance. In the 19th century, it was taken as given by many Western biologists, anatomists, neuroscientists, that women had smaller brains and less intelligence than men, that it was justified to deny women the vote, to deny women access to universities, because by nature we were inferior. And in fact, Darwin himself, in The Descent of Man, wrote that women are inferior in every other way except morally to men. So in every aspect of our, psychology, our intellect, our bodies, we were inferior to men. And he believed we had evolved that way, to be inferior to men. And this was used as justification again and again for denying women access to universities and access to the professions. And it was because they couldn't, at that time, it was so difficult for them to imagine in, Victorian British society, that women could ever do what men were doing because they were denied all these rights. They didn't have access to these things, so they couldn't do the same things as men, and so they took this to be a natural fact. That leap of imagination it takes to believe that something is possible, even when you haven't seen it, I think is something that even to this day, scientists find very difficult.
Okay. So, is this a good time for your story? I hope, yeah, because if...
Yeah, I don't think this story is directly related to the topic, or it might be related. We were waiting at a station, at a tube station in Chicago at near about midnight, and the train would come in another 5 minutes, and we were 5 authors from 5 countries who don't know the sound of each other's languages, because we were talking through 5 months in English. So one of our friends told me that let's recite poems in our own language and let's listen to the sound, how it sounds. We may not understand. So I recited a poem from Shankho Ghosh, and they all did. And the single girl, not any other soul, a single girl was standing on the other end of the platform in her school uniform with a bag. And my friend, who were a few pegs down, he just ran to the girl and told her that you have to now read out a poem, because this is a game on at the platform and you are a part of it. And she was taken aback. She told that, I don't know any of poems. So he wouldn't listen, and the train is late for 2 or 3 minutes. So after understanding that she won't be left alone, and she just put her bag on the platform. She came out of her shoes. She performed a piece of ballet and told us that this is the only poem that I know. So that day I kind of got to know that there's no rule about art. There might be definite rules about science, but there can't be boundaries and rules about arts, because it's so personal and so, every individualistic, and your perspective is very different from mine, and mine is very different from Ruchir. So how we look at art is something different from how science works for art. Definitely there's scientific things into art, into painting, into theater, into writing, there's technique. But after all these steps are achieved, there's imagination and there's your personal belief that this is art, what I think. So I think I rest my case here.
So you think the certitude, that's beautiful, yes. The certitude of science is something that makes it slightly different from the nebulous define nature of the arts.
Well, I think that science at its frontiers is very fuzzy. People don't know what they're dealing with. They argue. They are simply groping towards some answer. So in that sense, science isn't really very certain at all. And in fact, when new discoveries are made, they don't really become accepted fact until lots of other confirming observations
so
and discoveries are made.
Ballet seems like ballet till it becomes a poem.
Yeah, so I think there are some similarities, but what do you think?
I don't know. I feel like the older I get, the more I see that fuzziness in the science, and I think that's partly because I see the cold face, when I'm interviewing scientists, when I'm in academic environments, and especially now I've started teaching. I started teaching a couple of years ago, and I see among my students a real, genuine plurality of approaches to what science means to them and how they imagine it and how they think about it in the world. And I want to foster that. I think in the past, science writing has been quite dry sometimes and inaccessible and very fixed and, occupying a certain niche. But I want to see it expand more as an art form, you know, within poetry. I mean, I have a friend, Dava Sobel, who is a science writer in New York, and she edits the poetry column in Scientific American, and she gets these wonderful kind of huge meditations on science and, you know, at the very limits of what we imagine science is. And so for me, I want to see it appreciated as an art form in itself, and in order to do that, I think it has to become closer to the rest of arts and literature.
I think that's a great moment to kind of throw the conversation open to the audience. I also had a couple of questions on how both sides are fighting for attention span, because the rigor and the attention span which is required to write good literature or do great research is something we are struggling with at the moment. So while there may be, you know, nuances to their arguments about science and literature, the challenges they're facing right now seem quite identical. So are there questions? Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Where are you?
Here.
Here is very, very literary, not scientific.
Thank you for the interesting discussion. I was actually thinking about Renaissance figures like Leonardo da Vinci, and I think he kind of exemplifies a person who managed to blend like the spirit of scientific inquiry with like the artistic spirit as well. And we see that in his works that he did on anatomy and like fluids, study of fluids, which he then incorporated into his artistic works. Like his paintings reflect those studies. And I'm wondering why modern society doesn't produce more like people like Da Vinci. And like, do you think something could change to enable that to happen? Or do you think this is just the natural progression and we need more specialists to progress?
So who's going to answer?
One reason is that, especially in science, it has become so technical. I mean, Angela talked about how many scientists will know a lot about their own field, but they won't even know very much or anything about a field that's even closely related, that's just slightly different from their own field. And that's because it takes a huge amount of training now. The amount of knowledge you have to absorb is huge. Even among scientists, if you look at 17th century scientists like Robert Hooke, you couldn't classify Robert Hooke as a biologist or a physicist or a naturalist. He was all of those things. And it would be very hard to find a scientist like that today. There might be one or two exceptions, but I'd say it's very, very unlikely.
We had Jagadish Chandra Bose, as my friend from the audience pointed out, who actually was at the cusp of science and the arts with his metaphysical aspect as well as his scientific. So there have been those people back then.
Yeah, well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello. There seems to be, particularly in the West, a growing distrust of science. There's, standing here in 2025, there's more people that don't believe in vaccines. There's more people now that believe that the Earth is flat, the moon is not real, and Australia doesn't exist. So why do you think that is? Is science communication somehow falling behind or failing us now?
I believe you're from Sydney, so we feel your pain.
I've been to Australia, so I definitely know it exists. So I run a project at the Royal Institution, which is a scientific society in London. I launched that in 2019, called Challenging Pseudoscience. So our aim, we're just a disparate bunch of academics, scientists, policymakers, social media people, trying to get to grips with why it is that the public, you know, sometimes choose certain worldviews or ideologies that are at odds with rational thinking at the time or science at the time. And what we realized very quickly was that this wasn't a failure of access to information. And in fact, very many people, for example, anti-vaxxers, are very well informed. They educate themselves right across the board. They read everything, but they choose a certain set of facts for often for emotional reasons. So when people get drawn into these communities of conspiracy thought, which is essentially what this is, it is often because of for some psychological reason or some emotional reason. And very often that access point is children, that parents are told vaccines aren't safe for your child. You know, children have all these childhood vaccinations, so that's a point at which you're thinking about these things. And then you look online and you see cases of vaccine injury, which are real, you know, very occasionally this does happen. And then you start to, you know, you get drawn into this rabbit hole, and suddenly what the WHO is saying or what World Health bodies are saying or national health bodies are saying gets put to one side, and you choose that other thing. So what we've realized is that the way to access people then is not to just say, you know, you're ignorant, just read the information, the science is very clear. It's to engage with that feeling. What is it that makes you want to believe this? What is it within yourself that, you know, connects you to this idea and makes you want to, you know, associate with this community of people who feel the same way? And when you do that, you really can change minds. In fact, we did that ourselves. We ran a project online on social media where we had an influencer then use that approach, that kind of very slow talking through, understanding what it is that makes someone want to believe something. And we're all susceptible to this. It's not as though, you know, there is only a certain class of people who can fall down these rabbit holes. We all can. And when we recognize that feeling in ourselves, then we can understand it in others, and then we can start to, you know, move people away from that. But I think the key is, especially as a journalist, I think, is not to treat people as idiots. You know, to recognize that these are real feelings that they have and they come from somewhere.
Fantastic.
I
So
have
is
a
there any
question.
question for the
I have a
art?
question.
First here, and then we'll come to you. Yes.
All right, yeah, thank
And
you.
then we'll kind of wrap up.
So I'm just like slightly echoing from what Venki mentioned at the passing about whether you can just only dream to fly or you can actually be on the engine and fly around. So it comes from a very different understanding of things, because I meet such people who are executors, who are doing things, who are deploying science on a daily basis. But the role of activism around science seems to reduce, and the role of activism around social sciences, critical thinking, seems to increase, where perhaps the basic tenet of scientific thinking gets defeated. I have come to think of it in such a manner where the right wing also, perhaps in this country, back home, or on the global front as well, sees more people from the sciences, more engineers, trying to back that, where emotions, where impulses come into place. So is there something wrong with the pedagogy of science, or the way science is taught from the elementary levels up? Because the nurturing of science with minds seems to have changed drastically from what used to happen perhaps even 100 years ago. So how do we see that?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. Are you saying that scientists aren't engaged enough in social values and other aspects, and are very narrow technicians? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying scientists are not engaged in that. I'm just like saying that there is a larger discussion on science, or just the intelligentsia around science, starting from the elementary levels of schooling. Is there a flaw there that most of the engineers, the executors who make things happen, do not somehow tend to side with the scientific thought as much, and only with the capitalistic motives of science at the moment?
I don't know. I think
You go ahead.
I tried to pass the buck, but anyway, no. I think what you're asking is whether scientists are too narrowly trained and aren't paying enough attention to broader values and so on. And that may be, that's certainly an issue with the way that people are educated. People are often educated in a very, very narrow technical way. And by the way, I would slightly draw a distinction between engineering and science, although it's a continuum. But when I think of science, it's about uncovering fundamental truths about the world around us, regardless of whether it has applications or utility or profit. So I would say that there's a slight difference there, although, I mean, engineers are often great scientists. Many great discoveries were made by people with an engineering background. So it's a continuum, but I'm talking about the sort of emphasis or the discipline itself. And but I don't know how you engage scientists in broader questions about what's important. I mean, for example, one consequence of your idea is that what scientists or engineers choose to work on can be dictated by how they think about things. If they only think about making a great profit in a short time, they'll work on certain things. Or if they want to please the government in charge, they'll work on certain things. For example, the Manhattan Project, to develop the bomb. That was pure science, but in the service of a government. But at other times, they may say, look, maybe we really want to improve poverty or improve food security, and let's see where there's basic science allocated to that. Or, for example, differences in gender. That's something that people didn't think about as much 100 years ago. So I think the choice of problems is very much dictated by how you're trained and by the culture around you.
Fantastic answer. Very good answer. I think that will be the last question, which is from the front row. We have to head elsewhere. There's another book launch, as some of you may know.
I have a question which I wanted Ruchir especially to weigh in on. So it takes off from the first question in a way, where the silo thing that we started off with, and medieval and Renaissance universities had the trivium and the quadrivium, right? So they were doing science and humanities cheek by jowl at a fairly intensive and rigorous level till about from the late 19th century. It started to become like sort of hermetically sealed boxes, slowly started ossifying towards the 20th century. So this move now towards interdisciplinarity and, from super specialism to generalism again, is that resuscitating a pedagogic trend that was always already there?
I'm not a historian of science, so maybe Angela could answer that, but I would tend to think, it just makes no sense that, scientists are very curious about all sorts of things which are not just to do with scientific thinking. I know lots of artist friends, poet friends, who are completely fascinated by science. So, why would we not be? It's about stress, it's about what you can do and what you're interested in. And so you can call it generalism, or you can just call it a writing of a certain kind of balance away from a certain kind of patriarchal, colonial, white man education system, if you like. But again, I think that's too simplistic, because we've got our own traditions of patriarchal, divisions and silo workings in India as well. So, but I think this breaking down of boundaries that's happening here is because our survival instincts are kicking in. And we're realizing that science won't help us in just not knowing about science, and getting on with, listening to fine music or looking at fine paintings isn't going to save us either. So there's some animal instinct in us which is putting the two and two together and could lead to interesting things. I don't know. I'm being optimistic here.
I think optimism is a good note to end the panel on. And thank you for being so sporting, and Venki, Angela, Srijato, Ruchir, because all of them were in their own sense a little befuddled by the topic. But I thought it's important to just have people on both sides at least talk and discuss, perhaps argue, and somewhere converge, because as Ruchir ended on that note, that we've realized, you have realized you need to communicate through books and through literature. And they too have realized that with technology taking us to new frontiers. So thank you for bearing with this slightly offbeat session. I hope you enjoyed it. We hope to see many of you tomorrow. There are many lovely sessions happening here, as well as the Piazza. We have a small book launch of said book on 4043 that is being launched, and I would be happy and grateful if you could join us on the launch of that. What better way to end than with science fiction?
Mm.